Washing Tech.
We've been thinking about this from the perspective of making sure that options are widely available and that they're low cost and they fit a person's specific needs.
Welcome to the Washing Tech Policy Podcast. We deliver the latest tech policy news and brightest tech policy experts to you, wherever you are, so you can stay productive, relevant, and informed in less time. From Washington, D.C., it's the Washing Tech Policy Podcast with Joe Miller.
Google and Facebook come under intense scrutiny as attorneys general throughout the country, and the DOJ open investigations. PayPal suspends an account linked to the KKK, and can Uber solve transportation inequality? Malcom Glenn is my guest for this episode 200 of the podcast. The attorneys general from 50 states and territories launched an antitrust investigation into Google Monday. Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia are represented among those that filed lawsuits. California and Alabama abstained. And on Friday, another coalition of attorneys general from 8 states announced an investigation into Facebook. The coalition, led by New York State Attorney General Letitia James, will investigate Facebook's dominance in social media. And in addition, the Department of Justice made a document request from Google and its parent company Alphabet also on Friday. Alphabet says the document request is for documents released during a prior antitrust investigation. PayPal suspended the account of the Loyal White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan for 6 days. PayPal had pledged to suspend accounts seeking to raise money for hate groups, and the Loyal White Knights profile linked to a landing page requesting donations. Now the link points to a page that's no longer accepting donations, the Hill reports. Public schools in Flagstaff, Arizona shut down last week following a ransomware attack. In an effort to find the bug and prevent a reinfection, schools closed Friday as the school district investigated all of the computers issued to teachers and staff. Schools reopened on Monday morning. 14 anonymous women sued Lyft in San Francisco, claiming that they were attacked or kidnapped by Lyft drivers. The lawsuit alleges that Lyft mishandled the investigation of the drivers, keeping them on despite the reports. 5 of the women, including one woman who is blind, claimed they were raped. Jim Watkins, the founder of 8chan, the message board on which alleged mass shooters posted manifestos before their rampages, gave a deposition to the House Homeland Security Committee on Thursday. In his prepared testimony, Watkins wrote, quote, "My company has no intention of deleting constitutionally protected hate speech." The statement came the same day a federal court in the Northern District of California ruled that a man was barred by Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act from suing Facebook for treating his alleged hate speech more strictly than similar content posted by white users. And you can find links to all these stories in the show notes and also in our Twitter feed, and our handle is @WashingTech. Stay with us.
You're plugged into the Washing Tech Policy Podcast, the inclusive voice of tech policy.
My guest today is Malcom Glenn, currently the head of global policy for accessibility and underserved communities at Uber in Washington, D.C., where he leads Uber's worldwide efforts to make the current and future platform more accessible for historically marginalized groups, spearheading the company's work to improve outcomes for people with disabilities, low-income families, communities of color, rural residents, seniors, and returning citizens, among many other groups facing barriers to transportation or work. Please welcome Malcom Glenn. Malcom, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Joe. It's great to be here.
So let's start here locally in D.C., Malcom. What are some of the transportation equity gaps you see, and how is Uber working to correct them with its new biking program?
Well, to set the context, D.C. is, like so many other cities, increasingly in the U.S. and around the world, extremely segregated, of course, by race, but there's unfortunately a high correlation here between things like race and income. And so, here in D.C., we have the added issue of having some of that segregation and income inequality actually exacerbated by the physical geography. When you think about Ward 7 and Ward 8, the 2 poorest wards in the city by income, both sitting east of the Anacostia River. But of course, inequality is rampant, not just in those parts of the city, and there are other parts of the city that are transit deserts. And so we think about equity in a couple of ways. First, it's about making sure that anyone can get a ride in any part of the city, and making sure that some of our low-cost options like bikes, like Uber Pool, which is our low-cost ride option where you may share a ride with someone else, making sure that they're available all across the city. But it's also about making sure that we're thinking about equity beyond just geography and income. And so DC is one of a growing number of our major markets around the world where we also have a product called Uber Wave, which is our wheelchair accessible vehicle option, WAV. And we're investing really heavily in making Wave as reliable as possible and pricing it the same as Uber X, despite the fact that the cost to operate the product is significantly higher than any of our other product offerings. And it's worth noting that we're the only on-demand option in Washington, D.C. for people who use power wheelchairs. But, Joe, you mentioned bikes to start the question, and Jump Bikes is the pedal-assisted dockless bike company that we purchased in 2018. And we wanted to dig a little bit more into questions of transportation equity. And so earlier this year, we did an analysis in Washington, D.C. and in San Francisco that showed that large proportions of people are actually using jump bikes in areas poorly served by public transportation or docked systems. And so we then wanted to take it a step further, and we looked at Sacramento and Austin, Texas, and we found that there jump bikes are used twice as much in low-income residential areas versus medium and high-income areas. And importantly, more frequently during commute hours. And so we're able to understand that dockless options are more attractive to people who live in low-income areas. And again, we're the only dockless bike share option all across DC. And so we've been thinking about this from the perspective of making sure that options are widely available and that they're low cost and they fit a person's specific needs. But listen, Joe, we're going beyond, rides and bikes too. There's some really interesting things that we're starting to do to leverage the Uber Eats platform to get food to people who live in food deserts, thinking about food waste. And so I'm really excited about all of the opportunities that we have across our platform when you look at rides, when you look at bikes, when you look at Eats, to really meet the needs of people come from traditionally underserved communities.
So now turning to traffic in particular, the New York Times released a report a couple weeks ago on how efforts to segregate over the past century have affected those transportation patterns and caused really horrific traffic conditions in places like Atlanta and DC to some extent. How do you see Uber's role here? Obviously, Uber wasn't around to create those traffic conditions, but how does Uber work to alleviate them?
Yeah, it's a great question, Joe, and I appreciate you focusing on some of the historical remnants of segregation. That report talked about lots of the historical issues that transportation in this country has had segregating communities, particularly when you look at things like the highway system. But if you look at New York City in general, which I know is a point that was mentioned in the New York Times report, a majority of Uber trips in New York actually take place in the outer boroughs outside of Manhattan. And that's the part of the city where congestion is significantly less of an issue. And then if you look at the U.S. more broadly, about 82% of folks in the country now live in a place that has access to Uber. And going back 2, 3, 4 years, the majority of that trip growth has been in suburbs and in rural areas. And then if you step back even more macro, you look at Uber's footprint in the world, we're still less than 1% of total miles driven on the road. Now, of course, we want that to change and we want to continue to grow. But right now, we are a very, very small percent of both the transportation pie as well as the pie that is specifically taking car trips on roads. And so we think about congestion as a vitally important issue, but I think it's also important to tackle the root causes. And so we've been a very strong proponent of congestion pricing, which recently passed in New York City and is being considered in some other places. And that would mean that cars driving into the city center on weekdays would have to pay a very small fee. And we don't think we should be exempt from that. We think we should have to pay that fee too. And congestion pricing has been going on for a couple of years now in London, and it has significantly improved their congestion situation. And it hasn't done away with it in its entirety. But if you come up with a way to deter people who are most likely to drive their personal car to work every day, it can really start to have a meaningful impact on congestion, which I think is important to note is also really good for our business. Drivers don't like congestion. They make less money. Riders don't like congestion. It takes them longer to get where they want to go. And so if we can come up with something that spreads the very small burden to drivers who are most likely to drive their own personal car, get them to take transit, get them to take a bicycle or another option, and that's going to help cities, I think we're all in favor of those solutions.
And then the folks who demand it in the cities can take advantage of the programs you mentioned earlier.
That's exactly right.
So turning to pay equity, it's a sensitive topic. What are some of the issues around pay equity in the gig economy, and how does Uber work to alleviate that?
I think you're right. Pay equity is a vitally important topic, and this is something that we've tackled for the last couple of years, both from an employee perspective, but also from the perspective of what impact it may have on our platform. So I'll just give you one example from what we've learned here at Uber. So last year, we proactively commissioned a study to determine whether there was a pay gap for drivers on our platform. And so we looked at about 1 million drivers around the world over the course of about 2 years. And we found some really interesting results. One of the things that we saw was that there is a driver earnings gap between men and women who are driving with Uber of about 7%, and that doesn't include tips. And so it was interesting to us because drivers are paid the same, of course, in a certain geography based on time and distance, regardless of their gender. And so we wanted to understand what accounted for that gap. And so we dug in a little bit deeper, and what we saw that about a third of that 7% difference is related to experience. And so men tend to drive more, and more experienced drivers make slightly more money as they understand how to sort of optimize for their earnings. The second third of that 7% was related to speed. And we found that men actually drive about 2.2% faster on the Uber platform than women. And we looked at US driving data, and that's pretty consistent with what you see in driving more generally in the country. And then finally, we looked at the last third, and that's related to location. And what we saw was that men drive in more lucrative places and times. You think about when Uber tends to be most busy on weekend nights when folks are, sort of streaming out of the bars. Men tend to drive more frequently for obvious reasons, I think, than women do. And so we stepped back from that and said, okay, we understand that this gap exists. Is there a way that we can start to conduct some research to see how we can mitigate some of these gaps? For example, if higher speeds are resulting in higher earnings, how can we reward safe driving? Because we do see that there's a correlation between driving more slowly and more in line with the speed limit and decreasing your risk of getting in a car crash. And so, again, we released this study with the intention of creating a bit of a conversation about the ways that we can start to mitigate some of the unconscious biases that are both built into our platform, but they're also built into the driving ecosystem more generally. And so hopefully over time, we'll start to come up with some solutions as to how to close that gap, no matter how small it is.
So what are some of the other issues, Malcom, that policymakers and the public ought to be aware of?
Yeah, I think a business like ours that is so complex and so broad-based, and increasingly as it grows to include different components, eats, bikes, scooters, things like that, my focus always comes back to how we are serving the needs of people from the perspective of accessibility, equity, and folks who live in underserved communities. And of course, that's disproportionately about mobility, access to transportation, but there are some really valuable innovations taking place on the driver side too. So for years now, in a number of states, we've aligned our driver screening process around some initiatives intended to remove barriers for formerly incarcerated people. And that's happened most prominently in California. And a couple of years ago, we aligned our driver screening process there around something called Proposition 47. And Prop 47 essentially reclassified a number of nonviolent offenses from felonies to misdemeanors. And as a result of that work, we've seen thousands of drivers on the road who otherwise wouldn't have gotten a chance to work. And particularly as you are reentering into society, that's one of the most vital components to determine what your success is going to be on the outside. And the really important thing that we've seen in this work is that the ratings for the drivers under the new criteria are the same as the drivers under the old criteria. And this was a signal to us of a couple of things. One, access goes both ways, right? It's both for riders, for drivers, for couriers, for eaters, for everyone on our platform. And two, creating fair opportunities isn't just the right thing to do. And I think there really is a moral imperative there to engage in that type of work. But because we're getting a higher quality of driver, we're getting drivers who are driving more frequently on the platform, it's also good for our business. And the two are not mutually exclusive. You can do work that's going to be good for communities, that also helps the business. And this has been a really cool initiative where we've seen both of those things take place.
There's a lot, obviously, to unpack here that goes beyond just figuring out how to classify employees or how to work with municipalities. It's a major part of it, but it's been interesting hearing about how Uber's policy work ties into some of the social issues that affect all of us.
Absolutely, Joe. Thank you for the opportunity. And we still have a lot of work to do on all of these fronts. But I would just say I think we're proud of the progress that we're making. Now let's break the ice, get some career insights from you, and hear about what you're reading and watching these days. All right, if you could instantly become an expert in something, what would it be? Wow, Joe, that's such a great question. I'd say I would try to immediately become fluent in another language. Of course, there's practical benefits to being able to speak more than one language. Unfortunately, I can only speak English. But I think it also goes a long way in really showing people that you care by meeting them on the terms that make them most comfortable. So I think I'd probably learn another language. I'd pick the same thing. What's the best piece of career advice you've ever received? Wow. I'd say that I have deeply internalized the notion that in whatever work you're doing, with whomever you're engaging, it is vitally important that you are kind in everything you do. I would say that this is more important than any project, any request, whatever the deadline you're working on. And so I'm thankful that people have taught me relatively early in my career. And I'd encourage listeners to apply that to their own careers if they haven't already. And I would also say, kindness is great in your job, but it's also great in other parts of life. So I would say being kind and trying to be kind in everything you do. And I think the kindness naturally leads to integrity. I remember an employer when I first started out, first job out of college, asked me what was most important to me. And I remember I said integrity. And he said, that's all you got. That's all you got is your integrity. I love that. What are you reading and watching these days? Yeah, I watch a lot of TV, probably more than I would like to, but I recently read a really great book called Kindred by Octavia Butler. And, if you were coming up with the perfect set of interests for someone like me, it really checks all the boxes. It's about history and race and a little bit of science fiction sprinkled in. And I think for me, it really helped me think about, how we grapple with our past and the sins of the people came before us. And so it has sparked my interest in other Octavia Butler works. And so I'm looking forward to reading some of her other books. I picked up Colson Whitehead's new one, The Nickel Boys. It's a gruesome tale, but I really admire his writing. I read Underground Railroad. I was just really impressed by it. So now I'm reading this one. And, to your point about looking at the history of the evils of these issues that have plagued us for all these years, he really puts it he puts that historical context to fiction, and it's really interesting the way he does that. And he's really a brilliant writer, and I highly recommend that book, both books, Nickel Boys and Underground Railroad. Well, thanks again, Malcom, for joining me. Do you have any final ideas you'd like to leave with us before we close, and where can we find you online? Well, thanks again, Joe. And I would just encourage folks to check out a lot of the work that our team at Uber is doing. There are a couple of websites that I'd encourage folks to take a look at. One is uber.com/community, and then another is accessibility.uber.com, where you can learn more about some of the work that we're doing in the spaces that are particularly resonant with me. And of course, you can also check out my personal work, past and present, on my website, www.malcomglenn.com. And my name is spelled a little bit differently, Malcom, just one L. So it's MalcomGlenn.com. And you've been listening to Malcom Glenn, Head of Global Policy, Accessibility, and Underserved Communities at Uber. Malcom, thanks for joining me. Thanks, Joe. I appreciate you having me on. That concludes episode 200 of the podcast. Thanks so much to all of you for listening. If you like what we do, we'd love to hear from you. Please take a moment, head over to Apple Podcasts, give it a review. It helps others know what they can expect from the show and really helps us out. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you back here next week. Take care.
Washington Tech.